Good morning. Today we are talking about trig identities. And so the first thing that we're going to do is go through each of the identities and what each thing equals. And so before we talk about that, identities, and so an identity in math class is something that's always true. And so we know things about sine, and we know things about cosine, and we know things about tangent that are always, always, always true. And so we're going to use those to like rearrange equations and think through what those equations could also equal. And so we're going to use a lot of substitution today and verifying that this thing that's complicated, we can simplify that down to something else using our trig identities. And so on your paper, it's like an orange goldenrod color. And so you guys can fill that paper out and then glue that in your notebook so that it's brightly colored. You can find it really easily, and it's glued into your notebook so it's not going to fall out and you're not going to lose it. So we're going to start with first our reciprocal identities. And so the reciprocal of sine is 1 over cosecant. Cosecant of theta. And then cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. And so more than likely you'll use this one more often than you'll use this one. So the top one, we don't really like to get away from sine. We usually like to get things to equal sine and cosine rather than cosecant. But this is true as well. But this is the one that you're probably going to use more frequently, is that cosecant is 1 over sine. Cosine and secant, so 1 over secant and 1 over cosine. Similar to cosecant, this is probably the one that you're going to use the most. And then tangent would be 1 over cotangent, and cotangent is 1 over tangent. And so honestly, these are probably not the ones that you're going to use. These are probably the ones you're going to use more frequently, but it's good that we're talking about all of them. So these are all of your reciprocal identities. All right, and then your quotient identities. Knowing that tangent is y over x, we also know that sine is y and cosine is x. And so that's where this quotient means division, this is where our quotient identity comes from. Tangent is equal to sine over cosine, and then therefore cotangent would be equal to cosine of theta over sine of theta. So you can add those two identities to your sheet as well. All right, then we also have these identities called the Pythagorean identities. And so knowing what we know about Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or x squared plus y squared equals r squared. And so this is where we'll start today. We know that x and y, like we just saw on the previous slide, are actually cosine squared plus sine squared. And this is just the way we write this. The squared is above the cosine, because sometimes if you wrote the squared on top of the theta, it looks like the theta is being squared. And so we square the trig function, that's what's being squared here. And then when it's cosine and sine, then my radius is 1. And so my first Pythagorean identity is cosine squared plus sine squared is equal to 1, or on your paper it actually switches these, which is fine. Sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. All right, and so then going to the other two versions of this, the way that we get there is, let me switch colors real quick. So these are one option. And the way that we get to the other options are taking sine squared plus cosine squared and sine squared plus cosine squared, and we divide them by sine squared or cosine squared. So on this one, we're going to divide by sine squared, divide by sine squared, divide by sine squared. So everything in the equation is getting divided by sine squared. So sine squared divided by sine squared is actually 1. What we just saw, cosine over sine, is cotangent, still squared. So when you're simplifying things, as long as they're both squared, cosine over sine is still going to be cotangent. And then our reciprocal that we just saw, 1 over sine squared, is cosecant. And so it started as squared, and so it's ending as squared. So on your paper, this is actually the third one on your paper, so 1 plus cotangent squared is equal to cosecant squared. And we got there by dividing by sine squared. So then on this one, we're going to divide everything by cosine squared, cosine squared, cosine squared. And so sine over cosine squared this time is tangent squared. Cosine over cosine is our plus 1, and 1 over cosine squared is secant squared. And so you can add 1 plus tangent squared or tangent squared plus 1 on that one. That's the one in the middle on your paper, will be secant squared on your paper. And so these are our Pythagorean identities here. And so I'm going to make a new video for how we use all of these. So this is just what our identities are, and then the next video will be, okay, what do we do with all of these identities?